Some of you just picked up a book, the 25 books every Christian should read. I was invited to be on the editorial committee of that, and I wouldn't have thought of this if you hadn't just bought the book. But I remember we honed them down, a whole wonderful group. And when we finally decided on the 25 books every Christian should read, I said, I have to issue one complaint. Do you notice that not a single one has anything to do with justice or lifestyle or practice? And it wasn't our fault. It does reveal the Christian classics, and they are classics, of the first 2,000 years are all the clarifying of ideas, right? And that's probably what we needed to do in the first 2,000 years. So I'm not blaming anybody or accusing anybody, but the big exceptions to that, and I've always believed every time the church split or divided, like the Great Schism in 1054 with the Eastern Church, you could say, and it's not just being clever, we lost half of the gospel every time. And the half we lost at that great break, you see reflected in many of the Eastern fathers, the desert fathers and mothers, the Philokalia being the classic Eastern text. And if you read the Philokalia, it's all about practices whereby you can become a contemplative. Now that became one of our principles here at the center, that you do not think yourself into a new way of living, you live yourself into a new way of thinking. I think that was actually a cultural discovery. I remember when I was in theology in the late 60s, and a word emerged into our conversation, urban plunge. And here we'd been for years in a seminary, and Franciscan should have known better, because I'm going to show you how Francis didn't teach this at all, this orthodoxy in the head. He said, you do not know something until you have done it. You don't believe it until you have done it. But at any rate, an urban plunge was when we were allowed to leave the seminary and go live in the inner city of Dayton or Cincinnati at that time, and actually live in a hostel, live like the homeless live, visit all the institutions that are caring for them. What an education after being so many years in the isolated world of thoughts. And as I said, we Franciscans were programmed to think that way. The reason Francis, who has been called the first Protestant, for some good reasons, but the reason he wasn't kicked out is because he emphasized orthopraxy, not orthodoxy. Don't argue about metaphysics. Let the academics do that. We don't care. In fact, I always say it's easier to let the institutional church maintain the superstructure of creed and ritual and doctrine. Okay, that's fine. Someone's got to do that. And let them keep defining the substructure. That frees us to worry about the structure of our daily life. If you don't keep refashioning that. And that, I'm afraid, was the weakness of most of the Reformations. They met Catholics exactly at the same level and argued about metaphysics. All about orthodoxy, except for those few groups, the early Anabaptists, the Mennonites, the Amish, the Quakers, who were pretty much marginalized by our mainline churches because they emphasized orthopraxy. I read once, of course, I remember this because it was making me look good. It said there are only two Christian groups that don't carry a lot of negative baggage, Quakers and Franciscans. The reason being that they both emphasize lifestyle, not arguing about orthodoxy. Now that happened in some ways very practically, because, as I said, Francis himself was not an academic, even though we quickly moved there to make ourselves established and to be accepted. But that wasn't a temptation for us, because the first group of Franciscans were uneducated laymen. We weren't priests. We weren't clericalized yet. So the emphasis was what came to be called mendicant order. That might be a new name for some of you. But up to that point, the forms of religious life that were trying to discover the gospel at a deeper level were normally monks or hermits. But the idea of living right among the people, like the people, and begging for our dinner from them, the whole implication was, of course, Francis was taking the direction to the disciples seriously. He was a fundamentalist, but I always say he was fundamentalist about the right things. He read, Jesus said, eat what is set before you, go into a house and take advantage of the hospitality that's there. He said, okay, that's what we're going to do. So it was not just living like the people, but close to the people. Mendicancy demands you eat what they eat, that you enter into their house. Do you see? It didn't last very long. We're still called a mendicant order, but we don't beg anymore. We get salaries, well, not really salaries, but we're taken care of like we do in our society, because if we tried to live that way, it would be called vagrancy now. My real point is that Francis's entire emphasis was on how you live, and that you had to live simply to understand the crucified Christ. You had to live in solidarity with crucified people, or you would not know the pain of the world. Now, the other group that's done that to a very strong degree, although we kept them at arm's length until we couldn't anymore, and that is the religion called Buddhism, where they never argued about metaphysics. They refused to go there. And notice how the same thing of mendicancy emerged. The begging thing keeps you at the social level of everybody else and in their lives and in solidarity with their pain. It's not as strange as it sounds, even though I know we would call it vagrancy. But I think the reason so many people are attracted to Buddhism today is simply because now for many hundreds of years they have meticulously observed the seer. What happens when you do this? What happens when you think that? And so they became masters of process, which we now call practice. The great thing about practice, or orthopraxy, as you rightly called it, is that there really, honestly, is nothing to argue about until you do it. The whole thing is, go ahead and do it. Don't fight me about it. See, we got lost in, we had to prove our metaphysics, and then we had to enforce that you believe that. Every one of our churches. It was all the time we spent in enforcement, as if Jesus came to earth for enforcing ideas, And of course we burned people at the stake. Literally, we're untrue to Jesus because they didn't believe the right ideas. And I always hate to say it, but love to say it. I don't know a single example, I don't, maybe you do, of any of our churches ever burning anybody at the stake or whatever our forms of torture or exclusion were for not taking care of the widows and the orphans. I'm not aware. You didn't take care of the widows and the orphans. You can see the whole bias was what you believed up here. Now I'm sure again that was the level of consciousness of medieval society. It was tribal. History until the 20th century has been tribal history. You knew who you were because you were Italian. You knew who you were because you were Polish. And that was your identity. And you fought for Poland. You fought for Italy or whatever it might be. We live again in a wonderful time where we see that faith is not about belonging systems or belief systems, although it largely has been up to now. Belonging systems and belief systems. And what a lot of us are convinced of is that we need, if the Christianity is going to be renewed and reformed, it has to move to practice-based Christianity, where you simply encourage people to go do it. Go live with a woman on welfare for 3 days, and then come back and let's talk about welfare again. Do you understand? And most of our arguments proceed from non-immediate contact. It's all ideology. It's all in the head, where you can maintain these strong dualistic Republican or Democrat or gay or straight opinions. But we live in a wonderful time, and I do mean that, where we can't separate ourselves as we have been able to do in most of history, from gay people, from Buddhist people, from Quaker people, from, you understand, the globalization of spirituality is making practice absolutely essential, because people don't believe you anymore until you've done it. You can say whatever you want, you believe. And of course, what I see as a priest is that most of the things we said we believed were no skin off our back. I mean, it took, if I'm a good Catholic, I believe in papal infallibility. Well, we got along 19 centuries without that, so it can't be the core of the gospel in any sense. The virginity of Mary, which, okay, I'm not going to fight it. There's a lot of texts that seem to imply that isn't true in the New Testament, but I don't want to go there. It's fine, because it doesn't matter one way or the other. Do you understand? It really doesn't. But we'd excommunicate people because they didn't believe in the perpetual virginity of Mary, which asks nothing. Not that we're those people. Asks nothing of those people. The wonderful thing about practice, orthopraxy, is it asks something from you. That's why we largely teach contemplation here. Come on, join us, do it. And then you will see, and I'll just use this as an example, that almost all thinking is obsessive compulsive. There's no point in calling, oh, she's an obsessive compulsive. You just watch your own mind. All of us, we, as Eckhart Tolle, who lives in Vancouver, says, most thinking is repetitive and useless. That's what high-level religion came to understand. And until you develop a practice which reveals to you that your daily thinking is repetitive, obsessive, and useless, you'll keep calling it thinking, and it isn't thinking. So you can say, oh yes, I pray every day, and that means to recite prayers. But to go to a place where I have to go into this kenosis, this dying to myself for 20 minutes, dying to my own feelings, dying to my own angry thoughts. No one wants to do that. So you'll notice practice, if it's authentic orthopraxy, it always asks something of you. That's, I think, why we've avoided it this long. That's my cynical interpretation. Whereas orthodoxy allows you to be a policeman of other people, you understand? And never really do it yourself. Well, not even seeing that. You don't recognize you're not doing it yourself. But you just know he's not doing it. She is not doing it. So it gives you this false high moral ground without deserving it for a moment. So I think the game's over. It's been exposed. It's been exposed. Now, I'm not against orthodoxy, but I love to remind people. I was trained in Orthodox Catholic theology, which ironically allows me to talk this way. It does. That's the paradox of it. It trains you to see the big picture and to therefore critique the small picture. But as I was going to say, the word orthodoxy is not found in the scriptures. These young conservative priests, I'm an Orthodox priest. Well, very good. I'm glad you are, but there's no evidence that Jesus ever encourages this mentality. In fact, quite the contrary. Quite the contrary. I just read the gospel this morning of Simon the Pharisee, and how he has defined who's the sinner, the woman who comes into the room, you remember, and washes Jesus' feet. He's very clear about placement at table, about who's in, who's out, who's up, who's down. And Jesus just reams him out, as he often does. Jesus is never upset at sinners, though. He never reams out a sinner. He's only upset at people who do not think they're sinners. He's never upset at people who are wrong. He's always upset at people who think they're so right. And I don't need to prove it to you, I don't suppose, but I don't need to prove this to you. Do some practice. Go read the New Testament. And you say, my God, it's hidden in plain sight. It's obvious on every page. You cannot see what you are not told to look for. What practice does is force you to refine the seer. We used to call it epistemology. So metaphysics is what is. Epistemology is how do you know what is. And when you teach people metaphysics, without doing the Buddhist job and the Eastern Church job of also teaching them epistemology, how do you know what you know? I'm telling you, it gets us into a lot of trouble. A lot of arrogance, a lot of stupidity that passes for superiority because academic Christianity was allowed to look like Christianity. In other words, because you could verbalize it. And let me end by saying, isn't that ironic again? From a religion that believes the Word became flesh, the incarnation, that we put so much of our credence into words. It forever astounds me. Yeah. So.
I've got an observation, and it's puzzled me for quite some time about how we live and how we help others, and do we do it by our behavior, or do we act kindly and Christ-like toward others in hopes that they will understand where we are coming from and not attach anything to that. Let me give you a very specific example. In our churches I've been involved with have soup kitchens, if you want to call them that, food pantries, etc. And I know of others where they do have their mission work within a particularly highly populated urban environment, and they have their missions and they invite the homeless in, and even, they have places for them to stay overnight. They can stay there, they can't eat the meal, but only after hearing the gospel.
Hear a sermon.
Okay, so this is the exact example of orthodoxy versus orthopraxy.
Creeping back in.
Exactly, and I would hope that I could behave in such a manner that with kindness and with Jesus's principles in my heart, saying, I'm reaching out to you. If you need me, I am here.
But you don't have to join my club.
You don't have, in order to get a bed or to eat a bowl of soup.
Yeah.
So your thoughts, which side does that come down on, or does it come down on both?
Well, you're on the right track already. That the need for belonging and being convinced that you are right by having people join your group is much more love of self than it is love of God. So it's like if Christianity has largely been a belonging system instead of a transformational system, we so have that in our history that the best thing we can do for them is preach the gospel to them and get them to come to church. I can't help but wonder, that line in Jesus, I know it's a rather harsh one, but since it's from Jesus, I'll quote it, where he says, you go out and you make proselytes and you bring them home and make them 10 times more fit for hell than you are, or something to that effect. What else? That's the situation he's talking about. The assumption in that, the preaching to him first, is that I've got the truth and you don't. Do you ever see? I ensconce myself in a superior position. So in a sense, I'm not like Jesus. No, I'm not, attacking their good intentions. They're, for the most part, doing what they were told to do. But the underlying assumption is still something that keeps our superiority complex in place. So many of our Catholic missionaries, I gave so many missionary retreats all over the world for 20-some years. The great thing they learn after they're in the missions for, I'd say, as little as 3 years, they go to save the poor people in Nicaragua, okay? You meet any missionary who's been there more than 3 years, and I mean almost without exception, Catholic, Protestant, they say, I came here to convert them, and they converted me. We call that reverse mission, reverse mission. Until that happens, the I-thou relationship of the true body of Christ, Jesus' encounter, I don't think has happened. That mutuality that I talked about earlier, where she has as much to teach me, even though I'm supposed to be this higher one giving her the bowl of soup, if I knew what that woman has suffered, or whatever it might be, and could hear her story and allow her story to influence me, that is the body of Christ reformed. Now Jesus, 2 or 3 are gathered in my name. That's the church. So we can't maintain this one-sided evangelism where one group ensconces itself as the givers and keeps the other group codependent upon them as the receivers and calls that being like Jesus. I'm sure many people do that with the best of intentions, but very often it preserves them in a kind of hidden egocentricity. So we've got to say that. It's happened too often. I've seen it firsthand too often.
Well, and if you look at the orthopraxy of Jesus,
yes,
as opposed to giving the message and giving the food, which always comes first? You feed first.
There you go. That's excellent.
And then you preach or you teach.
Let me ask you this question, if I may, Richard. Again, everything you're saying makes enormous good sense to me, but we are incapable of having a contentless mind, at least outside of high contemplative states. So what difference does it make what we believe conceptually?
Well, no, if I'm not understanding your question, please come back. After saying all that I've just said, I would still, and I alluded to it, I still think good theology is important. Right here in New Mexico is a great example. You've all heard of the Hermanos or the Penitentes. We were the only priests here for almost 200, 300 years. We had New Mexico, all right? Then, because of troubles in Mexico, all of the Franciscans were withdrawn from this whole region. And what we did was we trained laymen, men at that point, to run the church. You're going to have no priests. We don't know when we're going to get back, as we didn't get back for 100 years. So this is a very unique experiment here in our state. For 100 years, these beautiful, well-intentioned, sincere laymen ran the church without any infusion of good theology. If you know the history, and they're beautiful, but it became very guilt-centered, very punitive, very moralistic, even beating oneself and crucifying people on Good Friday. So I just use that maybe as an outrageous example, though, of how devolved Christianity can get if you have no contact with the sources anymore. What happens when you don't have contact with good sources, let me just call it that instead of good theology, is charismatic, manipulative, dominative personalities take over. And you know this in every institution. The loudest personality, the most manipulative personality controls the show. So you finally have a choice between good teaching, good thinking, and you're right, we can't have a contentless head, or the cult of personality. That's what dominates, is the person with the loudest voice and the most aggressive person. So I'm all for, and as I said real quickly, one reason I can talk this way, with some degree of comfort, I hope, is that the Franciscans gave me excellent education in theology, that you know enough to know the big tradition, and then you can critique the small tradition with a little t. Yeah. And so many, at least in my church, So many who call themselves traditionalists, they think tradition is the last 200 years. And what it should mean to be Catholic, Catholic with a little c, which we all are, I hope, that means tradition with a big T. 2,000 years of Judaism, intertestamental, 2,000 years of Christianity. Connect the dots and see where it's going. What I found out, the center's been here 27 years now, and I've seen the vast majority of people experiment with contemplation, but not last. And that's very true, as true of liberals as it is conservatives. Again, there's why it's meaningless. And here's what I found. Some of the people who stay with it the longest, this might surprise some of you, are people who were charismatics back in the 60s. Now, maybe you're going to see the connection I'm going to make. If you haven't had a previous experience of an actual lover, presence, encounter, person, use any of those words, you don't know what you're waiting for. Do you understand? And you get tired of waiting for an energy or an idea or enlightenment. And liberal Catholics are oftentimes have not had this. Do you understand? They want to try, oh yes, I want to try contemplation. But if they have not had, I'm going to call it a Jesus encounter of any type, they've never had a Jesus moment where God, the baptism in the Spirit, as the charismatics would call it. If there's never been a baptism in the Spirit moment, I find by and large most people give up on contemplation. We're not Buddhists, do you understand? The ascetical, disciplined waiting, they put us to shame, We don't even know how to do that. We don't know how to do that. But I find again and again, in my own experience here and back in Cincinnati too, where I was my first 15 years, people who stay with it are people who already know that there's someone to wait for, that this is real, that God is real. They're not trying to manufacture God experience. They're trying to deepen already existing God experience.
Well,
I have never said that publicly till right here, because it's only become clear in my head the last year.
Well, part of it is the remembering.
Yes.
It becomes, once if you share that with others, it's like the AA thing about you don't keep it unless you give it away.
Unless you give it away. Perfect.
And the remembering of it, not as some distant thing, but as something, a recaptured, the anamnesis, the recaptured memory of what was real at that moment.
You're saying it. That's it. And it really gives me sympathy and patience for people who give up. They don't know what they're waiting for, or if it's worth waiting for. And contemplative prayer doesn't give you a lot of payoff. If you're not committed to the practice for itself, when it doesn't give you the payoff can you imagine our young kids who are used to this? Getting immediate payoff since they've been 6 years old, now learning contemplate, 2 years old, okay. Wow, they're gonna need contemplation even more. I can see why Bill Wilson and the 12-step people talk about the vital spiritual experience. And I'm told, just yesterday I got an email, said that he learned this from William James, the varieties of religious experience, that there has to be somewhere a vital spiritual moment, unitive consciousness, or you don't have the dynamo inside of you to want to return to it because you don't know it's there. Yeah.
I'd like to hear Richard talk more about keeping people engaged in pursuing that experience, even if they haven't had it.
When they haven't. Yeah, because otherwise people could go away with a fatalistic, well, I haven't had it, so. Well, you said you dread falling upward. I hate to talk about my own books, but the reason I wrote that is I feel for the vast majority, the falling experience, which is inevitable if you're living a real human life, all right, is the normal path of transformation. Now, I say and make it now, great love and great suffering are the classic paths. But you don't fall into great love or great suffering without falling. You don't go there intentionally, you know. It's always outside your control, something where I can't succeed at this. I don't look good. I just lost my house, my money, my marriage. And we don't want to wish these things on anybody, but again and again, you see that these are the things that catapult people into the second stage of life or unitive experience. And you and I know we can't program those, can we? Which we, clergy, were given the impression that's what Sunday was about. We would program a religious experience. And God, we tried, we really did. But I have met, in my 43 years as a priest, I've met hardly anybody who's had their peak experience at a church service. Hardly, and that doesn't mean they don't like them or they haven't enjoyed them, but that's not where it happens.
It seems like this conversation is raising a particular kind of task that we might have of accompaniment that makes it possible for people to give language to their experience, to their practice in a way that takes them beyond the practice into a level of meaning and deepening of consciousness. That we don't have a language to meet people.
It's just the language of faith as assent to doctrine.
That's right.
That's totally inadequate to the inner experience. You know? The ministry of spiritual direction is growing broadly. In fact, they're having their international convention here in our state next April. I get to speak at it. But it's very interesting that they're having a Jew, they're having a Buddhist, I'm, I guess, the Christian. But there's this broad recognition in Judaism, in Buddhism, and you use the right word, accompaniment.
Yes.
There have to be elders who are at least one step beyond you. Here's again the honoring of hierarchy. That I want someone to be a little ahead of me. I don't need to pull them down. I want to say, teach me, teach me. Those kind of people as teachers and as learners, I find are just proliferating today. It's wonderful.
It really is very exciting. It's very exciting. You know, we have to, at least we get one more session.
One more.
But we do have to bring this one to a close. And I can only imagine that things are bubbling for you folks. We haven't answered all the questions. We didn't set out to do that. What we have set out to do is to provoke you into deeper and deeper conversation in this journey of alternative orthodoxy. But now we have this word, perhaps it should be the new orthopraxy, but always within the context of the legacy of St. Francis and the wonderful leadership of our Franciscan Father Richard Rohr. So this is the end of this one. Over to you folks, and we have
Tim,
one more.
can I just add a little exclamation point? Alternative Orthodoxy is Orthopraxy. That's what you just said, but
Now,